The borders of the US states must be redrawn. If you've been with the channel for a while, you've heard me say this time and time again. But it's for a very good reason. The United States is fundamentally a federation. The states came together as independent entities to establish a union, and a federation system was meant to ensure that the people of the states retained a degree of local autonomy and due representation at the federal level. However, over time, the various populations of the US shifted, new populations came in, and changes occurred to dramatically reshape the lifestyle of various populations. But in all this time, never was there an effort to adjust the boundaries of the states to represent those populations. There were perhaps some incidental examples, but never a concentrated attempt to make the states representative of the people. States which may have at one point had a particular culture and political outlook became amalgamations, tearing themselves in conflicting directions not just every election cycle, but every time a major policy came forward which might favor one end of the state over the other. Now, new states were certainly created during this time, but with fewer than 5 exceptions, none came into existence for the consideration of the particular interests of the populations which inhabited them. That is to say, the creation of new states quickly became an arbitrary means of not providing representation and autonomy to distinct populations with their own ways of life, but plots of land for anyone within the boundaries at any given time. Worse yet was when it became a means to power, the divide between the North and the South, and for there to be an equal balance of slave and free states. This idea of the states as a means to power continues today, with the fear that creating new states would break the balance of red and blue states. This isn't something particularly difficult to do either, as we do adjust our boundaries every single decade. However, we only adjust boundaries within the states for the sake of redistricting. What is stopping us from building off this system and allowing counties or districts or towns who identify with a neighboring state to join that state, or even come together with enough like-minded communities to forge their own state? In the United States, people live in one of the greatest federations ever to exist insofar as its commitment to self-determination. Yet because of this fault in the way states are arbitrarily delineated, the merits of the federated system are enjoyed by so few, and many are fighting to correct this. Foremost among those movements today is the Greater Idaho Movement, and I had the pleasure of sitting down with Matt McCaw, the executive director of the group, to get his thoughts on redrawing state borders for the sake of representation, something I call Utahism because of how the Mormons had this unique opportunity to carve out a state based on their identity and interests. I was pleasantly surprised to find some members of the Greater Idaho Movement were fans of the channel and were familiar with the idea of Utahism. And we actually spoke about this a little bit, how what Greater Idaho is doing, and what various other states want to do with redrawing their borders, there is no good name for that. Or I should say, there was no good name for that until, of course, Utahism came around. It's not at all a matter of state secession where a state would want to leave the Union. And while we could use the term federalism, that term already has a certain connotation within the United States. When we talk about Utahism, we talk about a people within the United States who want to be better represented within the Union. They don't want to become their own country or have the country dominated by their particular way of life. They just want to have that security that their particular culture and lifestyle will be preserved within the boundaries of a state that actually represents them. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week where we talk about history and politics, so be sure to subscribe, leave us a comment about what you'd like to see next, and stay tuned for more. If you'd like to join the community, we do have a public Discord server linked in the description, along with a community-made subreddit loaded with memes, charts, maps, and more. And of course, if you'd like to help support the channel directly, consider becoming a channel member or donating to us on Patreon. Having dealt with censorship and demonetization in the past, especially when covering more sensitive topics, your support really goes a long way to keeping the channel going. All members do gain access to a separate members-only Discord server where you can speak with me directly. Now, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. Now, of course, when people seek to change the boundaries of their state, representation 99 out of 100 times will be the foremost motivator, but that can take on various forms, and these days, a common divide tends to form along the red-blue and rural-urban line. And while that rule stands for Greater Idaho, this runs a lot deeper than just dissatisfaction with contemporary politics.
We have a dividing barrier that goes right in the middle of our state, and that's the Cascade Mountain Range, and it's a natural geographic divide that separates the east half of the state from the west half of the state. Not only does that create a geographic divide, it creates a climate divide, it creates a culture divide, an economic divide. So this has always been the case in Oregon. The east side of the state is very rural, very agricultural, natural resource based economy, dry, high elevation. You go on the west side of the state, it's low elevation, lush, green, very wet, holds a lot of population. You have the tech industry up in Portland. So you have this difference between the west side of the state and the east side of the state that's just a natural geographic climate divide as well. This has always been the case in the state of Oregon. In fact, when the state of Oregon was first founded back at the first constitutional convention back in 1857, there were 60 delegates that came. At that point, the Oregon Territory was Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And in the very first Oregon state constitution, there were 60 delegates. 59 of those delegates came from the west side of the state, and 1 delegate came from the east side of the Cascades. That 1 delegate that represented all of Eastern, or what would be Eastern Oregon, said the people in Eastern Oregon would want the dividing line for the state boundary on the Cascade Mountain Range because it made sense. That's where the natural geographic divide was. There would always be a difference between the east and west. These two sides would not have similar interests moving forward. This was in 1857. It was an obvious decision then, much like has happened today. 59 delegates from the west side of the state said, no, we want to put the line. We want a big footprint on the map. We want a lot of land. We want to be a big state. And they put the border where they did over the wishes of the people of Eastern Oregon. Fast forward 168 years, the exact same thing happens and has been happening in our state for my lifetime, essentially since it was formed. The interests of the west side of the state are different than the interests of the east side of the state. The culture and the politics of the west side of the state are different than the east side of the state. This has been a long-standing problem from the beginning. And there really is no political representation for the people of Eastern Oregon or no political power. And so you have that combined with the fact that our politics have gotten very, very polarized and people don't agree on almost anything anymore. And our two sides are so polarized and so partisan, it's not tolerable to live under the rule of these people that have radically different values than us, live hundreds of miles away. About 5 years ago, the Greater Idaho Movement came along and said, we think we can solve this problem and create a win-win for both sides of the state by simply moving the imaginary line that was placed where it was 168 years ago. If we moved that imaginary line to the actual geographic and cultural divide in our state, then the people of Eastern Oregon, which vote overwhelmingly Republican and conservative, about 70 to 75% red, would get their governance from the state of Idaho, neighboring state, which is incredibly conservative. Legislature is about 80% Republican. And it's the way the people in Eastern Oregon vote. They vote for the kind of government that Idaho has, but the people in Eastern Oregon never get it. If we move that line and let them join Idaho, not only do the 400,000 people of Eastern Oregon get governance that makes sense for them, that they're voting for, but it also allows the people of Western Oregon to still have the government that they're all voting for. It really is a win-win political solution. I mean, it's been 168 years since the people of Oregon got to decide where the boundary was. Nobody alive today had any say in where that imaginary line was placed. We've come along as a movement and we've actually asked the people, well, which state would you rather be part of, Idaho or Oregon? And what we found out is that the people of Eastern Oregon would rather be part of Idaho. We should be trying all we can to get those people the kind of government that they actually want. And it's not just a few people, it's a strong majority, a vast majority. We're winning handily in these elections because Eastern Oregon is an incredibly conservative place and it's an incredibly like-minded place. You know, I get people sometimes that they argue, you know, well, about what about the minority? And I understand we're not talking about trying to move counties into a different state that vote 52-48. We're talking about counties that vote 75-25. It doesn't make any sense for those counties when the vast majority of people that live there want to be part of another state. It doesn't make any sense. And it's not morally right to force them to stay part of something they no longer want to be part of.
As someone who's a firm believer that the state borders must be readjusted, I'll often encounter naysayers who simply do not believe it's possible. People who say it's too much work, what's the point, and even arguing that state borders don't matter. Wars have been fought across the globe to move the imaginary lines just a couple miles in either direction. Whether it be for access to resources, representation, or security, borders matter. And to argue that internal borders don't matter is essentially to argue that all borders don't matter. The difference with internal borders is we don't have to worry about security as much, but the need for representation and resource access remains all the same. Doubly so when concepts like self-determination and federalism are ingrained in the foundational document of the country. The Greater Idaho Movement is no stranger to these naysayers either.
And state borders have moved dozens of times. A border is an imaginary line. It's meant to group people for political purposes. And Dean, we do this every 10 years when we redistrict and reapportion. So every 10 years, our country takes these imaginary lines and it redraws them around groups of people with the intent of getting better representation for those people. It takes some representatives and it gives them to another, all for political representation. We already have mechanisms in place to get people better representation of their government. That's a key aspect of our system. That's all that we're asking to do. It's a different way of redistricting. We're saying this line, this imaginary line that was placed in this spot 168 years ago, placed in this spot against the wishes of the people who lived here, by the way, that line can be moved. And in this case, that line should be moved. And again, if you ask the people who live here, they want that line to be moved. If you ask the people that they're trying to join states with, the people in that state say, yes, we would love to have these people. They think the same way that we do. They have the same values. They vote the same way. Their economies are incredibly similar. They would strengthen our state. We would love to take them in. Even polling that's been done of Northwestern Oregon. So there was polling done a couple years ago in Northwest Oregon. So that's the Willamette Valley. That's the most left-leaning place in Oregon. And even when they asked Northwestern Oregonians, if the counties in Eastern Oregon vote to leave and join Idaho, should the state of Oregon let them go? More people said, yes, we should, than said, no, we shouldn't. People in the United States inherently understand self-determination is a good thing. It's a key component of self-governance, is that you have government for the people, by the people, with the consent of the people. What we're really after is we're after better representation, better government that matches people's values and what they actually vote for it. And that's the end goal. We believe that moving the border makes the most sense. We believe this creates a win-win. This really does create wins that people in Western Oregon can say, yes, now we have more of our tax dollars at home and we have more autonomy over our part of the state because we have better political representation. We can implement the kind of policy that we want without interference from people that live hundreds of miles away with very different values than us. So we believe this solution is the best, and we believe it's a long-term solution, that we can implement this solution and solve this long-standing problem. We've gone to the people of Eastern Oregon and asked them if they want us to pursue this solution, and they've told us yes 13 times. So that's our focus. That's where we're pushing, but we understand that there's never just one solution to a problem, and that there could be other ways to achieve the same results, but moving the border would be the best and simplest way to tick off all those goals in one swoop. People ask us, well, why don't you just create your own state? Well, if we created our own state of Eastern Oregon, it would be 400,000 people, which would be the smallest state population-wise in the country, and it would be 2 Republican senators. And I can guarantee you that the U.S. Congress, as closely divided as it is not going to give 400,000 people in Eastern Oregon 2 Republican senators when there's only 2 Democrat senators for the 45 million people of California. That's just not politically feasible. Moving state borders takes that problem away. You can move the line between Idaho and Oregon, and you can move those 400,000 people into representation that so much better matches what they want and their values. It doesn't upset the federal balance of power at all. You're talking about one electoral college vote. One representative from Eastern Oregon would go into Idaho. That is already a Republican representative. That is a representative that is already slated to go from Oregon to Idaho in the next census because of just population changes. So there's incredibly small impact federally by moving state boundaries. Whereas creating new states, like you said, it became a power thing. It became, well, if you're going to, put in a new state with 2 Democrat senators, then we need a state with 2 Republican senators. You can move state lines and not have that issue. We absolutely think this is a good idea. We absolutely think this is doable. And we're not the only ones. This is now an idea that's starting to pop up in other places. State borders have been moved dozens of times. Oregon actually moved their state border in 1958 with Washington. A lot of people don't realize that. Before I got involved in this movement, I didn't realize that. I didn't realize there was a mechanism to do this until I got involved. But there is, and it's been used many times. There's now a movement in Illinois because they have a similar problem to Oregon, where you have the Chicago metropolitan area dominates state politics, but you get downstate, and the people in downstate Illinois are nothing like the people that live in the Chicago metro area. They don't want the same things as they want. And so there's a movement to separate from Chicago and perhaps join Indiana, move the state line between Indiana and Illinois. There was a bill that was introduced in Iowa to take in the southern counties of Minnesota. You have the same issue. Minneapolis-St. Paul doesn't represent the values there. The politics that comes out of Minneapolis-St. Paul does not represent the values and the politics of the people of southern Minnesota, more rural. This is an idea that people are starting to wake up to and say, whoa, we could take these imaginary lines. We could move hundreds of thousands, if not millions of citizens from government that they don't want and they don't vote for and causes political tension. We could move them with these imaginary lines into government that they do want, they do vote for, and better represent people, better group people, and it would lower the political tension in our country.
This is something I've often spoken about, how so often in the United States you have polarization not only at the federal level but at the state level, and this is where it becomes most fatal to our unity as a country, because again, we are a federation. The foundation of our union is built on the principle that we have this degree of local autonomy to preserve those things most important to us as people, not as states, but as people who must have states that represent us. But when a people have no state, when you have a state like Oregon or Pennsylvania or New York or Illinois pulling in different directions and you feel like you can't have a government that represents you and protects your way of life, what can you expect but for this to sow discontent and radicalism? That's why Utahism is called Utahism, because of all the states in the Union, Utah is among the few uniquely founded to represent a people and continues to do so. The results speak for themselves. It ranks among the highest states for quality of life, satisfaction with government, and despite being one of the most heavily Republican states in the Union, it is politically among, if not the least radical and most pro-Union states in the country. That is to say, when national elections don't go in the Republican direction, while some states might argue that it's time to secede, Utah confidently says, no, we're quite content remaining in the Union. And this is not exclusive to Republicans either. When you flip the elections around, you hear the same response from the Democrat states. Within them, you have this radicalism that has been sown by the sense that their ways of life are not secure, that they have to fight, that they have to engage in this culture war to maintain the status quo that they're used to. While achieving a readjustment of borders is far from impossible, it's not to say it isn't an uphill battle. Matt was telling me about how the process to move the border should be straightforward but has run into hurdles along the way.
Any two states can change their border if both states agree to it. And so that's been the process. It's called interstate compact. They basically draw up a contract and say where the line isn't working for both of us. We think it would help both states to move the line from here to there. And once they draw up that interstate compact to do that, if it gets approved by Congress, which the vast majority of interstate compacts that have regarded borders go to the US Congress have been signed off on by Congress. We've been to the Idaho legislature, and the Idaho legislature passed a memorial inviting the Oregon legislature. The Idaho legislature understands how adding Eastern Oregon and all the land and all the resources and 400,000 like-minded people and the tax base that goes with that, they understand how that would strengthen and make Idaho better, and they're ready to have that conversation. The governor has been supportive. Our roadblock to making this happen has been the Oregon legislature. The Oregon legislature is a supermajority Democrat legislature. So Eastern Oregon is very, very conservative. We have 4 or 5 representatives from Eastern Oregon that represent us in the Oregon legislature. They're all Republican because Eastern Oregon is incredibly conservative. But the Oregon legislature as a whole is a supermajority Democrat legislature. We have had bills introduced. We have 2 bills sitting in the Oregon legislature right now, one in the Senate, one in the House, waiting to be moved, waiting for action from the supermajority in the legislature, and they've refused to do that. So our roadblock has been getting elected leaders to actually pick up the mantle and do what the people are asking them to do and voting and saying they want done. And we've had a little bit of that on our own side. So, one of the things that was surprising to myself, and I think a lot of other people in our movement, was we started going to these votes in Eastern Oregon, and the people were saying overwhelmingly, yes, we want you to do this. And I think we all just kind of assumed that would translate into our own representatives. So the people that represent me here in Central Oregon, that representative would just say, okay, the people have voted, this is what they want, I'm gonna advocate for this. That hasn't been the case. What we've noticed is that elected leaders in general on both the right and the left have been very resistant to moving this forward. There's been it's taken a long time to get the people on, even in Eastern Oregon, that represent Eastern Oregonians, to be willing to advocate for this, even in a small way. But we are getting there, and we have more now where our Eastern Oregon representatives are doing that. But the big hurdle is the Western Oregon legislators don't have to let us go. They have us under their control and under their thumb, and they don't have to let us go no matter how much we vote for it. And so far, they've shown that they're not willing to let us go or even have the conversation. There was a lot of thought that went into how we crafted this proposal to make it a win-win. And so one of those things is that Eastern Oregon is a drain economically, tax-wise, on the state of Oregon. And that's because, like most rural areas, it's not as wealthy as the metropolitan areas. And because Oregon has a pretty robust social service, system, and it has an income tax that it collects across the state and then redistributes, Eastern Oregon ends up being an economic drain on Western Oregon. So by letting us go, Western Oregon would save billions of dollars per budget cycle. And they could use that money to solve the problems that are specific to Western Oregon. We don't have a gigantic homelessness problem out here in rural Eastern Oregon, but they do in the metro area. And that's money that they could use to solve problems specific to their communities. So there was a lot of thought that went into that. How do we take just the counties that make sense, that vote like Idaho, that would create an economic win for Oregon? And the beauty also of Eastern Oregon is because Eastern Oregon geographically and climate-wise and economically is so similar to Idaho, Eastern Oregon's a drain on Oregon's tax base, but it can move into Idaho and actually be a net positive in Idaho because Idaho counties are almost exactly like Oregon counties. So again, we crafted a policy that would create wins for everybody involved. And I think that's a big piece of it. Unfortunately, that has not been enough to get any kind of movement at all. The next step is we need some help. We need help from the rest of the country to put some pressure on Oregon. We need help from the federal government to put some pressure on the state of Oregon. Because again, most people in the United States very much believe in self-determination. They very much believe that people should have the kind of government, they should be in charge, and they should have the kind of government that they want and that they vote for, and it should be the people that are making those decisions. And so that is a very widespread belief, left, right, across the country. Most people are not aware that there are places in our country that counties have voted and said, we want to leave this state and join another state, peacefully separate. We're not going to ask for anything from you. We just want to peacefully separate, and we're being held captive against our wishes. Most people don't know that. They're, even though we've gotten a lot of publicity, there's still a lot of people who have never heard of Greater Idaho. Once most people do, I think most Americans would say, that's not okay. That's not right. What's going on out in the state of Oregon, and why is the state of Oregon holding these people captive against their wishes? So we need social pressure from the rest of our fellow citizens, and we need the federal government to step in. The federal government has immense leverage over the state of Oregon. Tens of billions of dollars a year flow into the state of Oregon from the federal government. The federal government could step in and say, it is not okay to hold these people captive against their wishes. You need to let them go. And until you do let them go, we're going to withhold some funds and exert some pressure there.
Really, the biggest hurdle of all seems to be the lack of awareness among people that border readjustment is possible. Many, both politicians and citizens, when propose the idea as a means of furthering representation, default to a status quo response because this is an unorthodox approach that is not often done. Often you'll hear, well, our borders have always been this way. You can't redraw them, that's impossible. How would that even work? As Matt and the Greater Idaho Movement have just outlined, and as we've outlined in great detail over at the Utahism website, this isn't just doable, but it's ideal. It is a solution to the debate of representation. It is a solution to the debate of local autonomy. It is a solution to the debate of the culture war. Because if you feel like your way of life is safe and secure in your home state, there's no need to fight to standardize it at the national level, which may be all well and good for you. But the reality is, this is a very diverse country insofar as how people live, what they care about, who they are. The plights and concerns of the people of these several United States are real, and it is only the failure of the states to fully represent the people that fuels this frustration. The normalization of border readjustments, making that something that occurs in tandem with our redistricting, achieving Utahism not just for the people of Oregon and Idaho, for Illinois and Indiana, for New York and Pennsylvania, but for all states, for the stateless Americans whose best option up until now has been to uproot their lives and move away from the only home they have ever known. Every American deserves a home of their own, a state where they feel represented, just as Utah gave the Mormons a state where they could be masters of their own destiny, and proud participants in the Union. Movements like the Greater Idaho Movement and countless others which do or will exist need attention, need a voice, and need to work together and show the American people and the American government that a better future is possible.
Of course, you can always help our movement by going to greateridaho.org and signing up for our newsletter and following us on social media and liking our things and sharing our posts and financially supporting us. There's a host of ways to help us directly. We are kind of at the point where we need help from the rest of the country. We've kind of gone as far as we can go in our state with our people. We are a grassroots organization. So again, Greater Idaho is a group of people, of Eastern Oregonians that are trying to solve a problem that just came together. We don't have these huge funding, sources. We're just a group of grassroots people that are trying to make this change. And we've asked the people of Eastern Oregon, and we know what they want to do. So now we got to figure out a way to budge the Oregon legislature. So raising awareness from the rest of the country, calling out the state of Oregon, talking to your own legislators and people in charge and say, what's going on out in Oregon, and how can you help nudge them to do the right thing and let these people go who voted to leave. And then the next piece is really, we have to get to the federal radar, and we have to get on the Trump administration's radar that this is something that needs to happen. It's morally wrong to hold people against their will who voted to say they want to separate. And we need the rest of the country to take up our cause and say, it's not okay. It's not right what's happening out there, and put some social pressure on the state of Oregon to do the right thing, or financial pressure to do the right thing. As far as doing this in other states, we are more than happy to share with anybody who wants to look into a movement like this in their own state. And we've talked to the folks in Illinois and we've talked to folks all over across the country that want to do this, that where it makes sense and where they want to go to the people and ask them if they'd rather be part of a new state. We are happy to share our experience and how we've gotten to where we are. But absolutely, people should be looking at this as a viable solution that might be able to make their county, their state function better. And so any support they can give to local movements or our movement is appreciated. It's one of these solutions that most people, when they hear it, they have two reactions. One, they say they don't think it's possible. Like, you can't, like, these states have always looked this way, right? Like, you can't change those lines. That's what the map has always looked like in the United States. Once they figure out it's possible, they say, oh man, that makes all the sense in the world. Which is why when we put the solution out there to people, overwhelmingly, they say, yes, we should be pursuing this. It makes sense.
Matt is precisely right, and I want to thank him for joining us again to share his experiences and insight. I'm a firm believer that there's typically multiple pathways to victory, and in the case of the Greater Idaho Movement, they've tried almost every avenue and find themselves at one of the conclusions that I came to with Utahism, which is that we need to start working through federal level policy toward making this something states, counties, and populations can more easily achieve without all this hassle. And the way that happens is through grassroots activism, building awareness that Utahism is an option, that states don't need to be tearing in opposite directions or be broad coalitions that fail to satisfy anyone. I'd encourage everyone to check out the Utahism website, write to your politicians, and consider launching your own Utahism chapter. Utahism chapters are decentralized, so once you're familiar with the basics and have a couple friends willing to do the volunteer work to promote the concept, you can get started getting the word out there. Readjusting state borders is an option. Once enough people realize that, there's the potential for genuine change. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.